everybody. I'm Brian Seth Hurst along with Allison Norrington, and we're welcoming you back to the Story Hour, where this week, part two, with our guest, who is...
Bryan Behar. Welcome back, Bryan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I'm glad I made the cut.
Or you look like you haven't aged a bit since last week.
No, put on 5 pounds, as you said.
Yeah. And don't be thrown off. I'm wearing the same shirt, but it is a pandemic. You're lucky you even got me in a shirt. So this is,
I had mentioned that to Allison earlier. I said, with Bryan, it might be good just to be the podcast and not to be the YouTube. But you've proved us wrong. So now we want to get into the nuts and bolts. The first story, for those who haven't listened to it or haven't watched part one, exceedingly inspiring. Everybody has obstacles that they confront in life. You can either turn around and walk backwards, or you can walk around or walk over or walk right through. And Bryan, you walk right through. So for people that didn't hear or listen to or see part one, we recommend you go back and do that. Over to you, Allison.
No, well, Bryan, Allison, and I have decided that this episode is going to be decidedly less inspirational. So if you're looking for inspiration, listen to this one. It's a very weird note to give, but we're gonna pull it off. I promise.
I'm sure we can do that.
I'm inspired by that, Bryan.
You failed already.
Wow, I can't believe it. I am that motivational.
And there you have it.
Well, you know what, Bryan, from our talk last week, and I did say to you after, and I would just like to say again, that it's really hard when you've taken a few punches and you're tired to kind of try and stay refreshed and put your face out there and keep moving ahead. And I know that that's not easy. And also know in pandemic times, there's a lot of people struggling. So, hats off to you on that. And I do think that your biography should be called The New Adventures of Old Bryan, because there's definitely a journey there that you're on, right?
Yeah, that's a great title. I think I'm afraid the woman who created the show may disagree with me co-opting her title, but which may be reason enough to do it. So we'll see.
Since when did that stop you?
Yeah.
But what I want to talk about is, I want to go into the craft a little bit of comedy, because I think it's quite tough, isn't it? It's quite a personal opinion in terms of what works and what doesn't work. So when you're in a writer's room or you're collaborating, because you said you're writing alone now for the first time in 25 years. Right. And that must be really nice to be able to do that, because you can go with your own gut feeling on what works. When you're working collaboratively with writers in comedy, there must be sticking points where there's differences of opinion as to what is the best approach to take to get the laughs. How do you tackle that as a showrunner? How do you make sure that all stays with the same kind of thread and the same tone?
Wow, there's really multiple questions within that one question, and I'll try my best to answer none of them sufficiently. Let me start with because I didn't know that you were going to ask as a showrunner. I thought perhaps you were going to ask as a writer on staff. Which, let me even take it back a little further. I don't know that everyone knows that all television, but specifically sitcoms, are written collaboratively.
Yeah.
In a group.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you've seen, as we referenced Dick Van Dyke earlier on the previous episode, if you've seen something a little more contemporary like 30 Rock, that is akin to how it's done. It's a group of people in a room, and one person is in charge. Mm-hmm. So a couple things come to mind. Number one, the writer's room is really as good as the showrunner allows it to be, and as good as the people that you have in it. Mm-hmm. I've been on 21 shows, and I've seen truly by now the gamut of everything from a writer's room can be a beautiful thing, a well-oiled machine where everyone is rowing in the same direction and has the same comic sensibility. Or I've seen situations where a showrunner doesn't have a point of view and can't make up their own mind. And something that will entirely slow a room down. I've worked with showrunners who don't like their families or are going through a divorce, but don't tell you that, but keep you there until 4 a.m. because they themselves don't want to go home. And then from the sort of the room standpoint, you have people who, on the one hand, are trying to fulfill the vision of the showrunner and will pitch things that they know are germane to the topic at hand. And then you have people who will hijack a room just for their own purposes and fight to get what they think is their version of the show past the showrunner who's already told them that it wasn't. So it's a really fascinating, it's a microcosm of society, like at large. You know, sometimes people are all have the same goals and they're all going in the same direction, and it's beautiful. It's like it's like a band that's been together for 20 years, all jamming, and you know where to improvise, and you know telepathically where people are going. And then there are rooms in which it's a lot of conflict, and it's like watching Big Brother, and there's alliances, and there's people sabotaging or backstabbing others. So like anything you could think of, essentially in human dynamics, you will find in a writer's room, but only exacerbated because you have millions of dollars on the line, and you have incredibly challenging time constraints, and you're tired, and you feel trapped. So it can be great, and it can be the worst.
I have a question. So,
yes.
In what I guess I would call a dysfunctional writer's room, are you able to tell, you, Bryan, personally, when you're watching a show, are you able to tell the kind of writer's room that show has going on by the end product?
Absolutely not.
Wow.
And in fact, I've almost experienced the opposite, which is I've been in rooms which were so lovely, in which we all got along and just laughed from the moment we got there to the moment we left. And then you watch the show on television and you're like, there isn't a fucking laugh anywhere in here. And you're like, what were we laughing about? Because the show is woefully unfunny. And then I've been on shows that are just so terminally boring in the room. Like either they are, you're watching a showrunner think, or you're in a room with like a pedantic showrunner and there's no laughter and it's just lectures on philosophy and psychology. And by and large, those end up being the shows of the ones that I've been on that people love the most. So there is almost no correlation, nor is there any rhyme or reason. And I don't know why that is.
That's fascinating. Does it necessarily translate to the set? Because, you hear Hot in Cleveland, for example. Hot in Cleveland was a hot ticket for any guest star.
Sure.
Because they love the set, they love the writing, everything about that show, what you hear about it, and of course you're not in the writer's room, was love. And so your thought as someone who's in the industry is, boy, that must be a really happy show to work on. Everybody there seems so happy. Does what's going on in the writer's room translate onto the set necessarily?
No. And I realized I jumped into my answer pretty quickly there. So let me backtrack and actually give you a real answer, which is, what you may hear on the outside about the warmth and geniality of a set may be complete BS. And believe me, I've been stunned by that, because you take a job oftentimes thinking like, wow, this is a happy family that's been on the air for a long time, and then you are really sort of blindsided by attitudes and betrayal and a lot of maltreatment at the hands of the actors. I won't get into which show, but it certainly was it definitely was my last one. And that ended up being okay, but like there was a lot of conflict when I took over the show, when I took over Fuller House, because they did not want new showrunners, but that was sort of foisted upon the cast and the crew, and no one was really eager to welcome us in as the showrunners, and that was made perfectly clear throughout our first season at the helm. And it got a lot better in the second season. And I felt we were able to do a lot of sort of fence mending. But to take it just generally speaking, oftentimes you can hear about a set that's really warm, and it might be. They might all love each other, but it doesn't mean they love the writers. And it doesn't mean that the writers and the cast are in concert. So, again, when you've done 21 shows the way I have, I've had every kind of writer's room experience. I've had every sort of, town gown experience, in terms of writers versus the actors, writers loving the actors. It really all depends, and there's no hard and fast rule that allows you to be predictive of what kind of show you're getting yourself into, except really the more they tell you how lovely they are is usually symptomatic of how lovely they are not. And that I can sort of stand by, I'm afraid.
And how does that pan out then, to take it to another level? Like when you're talking about how things are on set, when you're they're in front of a live audience, like that's immediate response.
Yes.
I mean, so for example, like I wrote novels and then I moved into plays, and the first play I wrote, and I hid behind the curtain on the stage and looked out at my audience for the first time ever, and they didn't laugh at the stuff I thought was funny, and they were wiping tears at the thing I thought was maybe just a little bit sad. I completely misread their reaction, and it changed the way I wrote, right? It was actually quite a massive moment. So yes. You guys, with a live audience there, how does that impact on how you proceed, or your perception of who you're telling the stories to?
That's a great point. Let me answer that in a couple of ways. Number one, there's still no greater joy, even though I am now 25 years into this. I'm now 55 years old, but there are still few things that bring me as much delight as hearing an audience laugh at something that I wrote, or something that I, as a showrunner, approved that someone else wrote. There's no substitute for instant human feedback, and so the audience isn't wrong. The audience will tell you whether it's funny. So that hasn't gone away, and I as much as the business has moved away from those kind of shows, and fewer are taped in front of an audience, and more have been taped what they call single camera, movie style, without an audience. I feel we are missing it. We are missing that communal experience, and we are missing like a true feedback on jokes. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes people can do shows single camera. Some are great. Obviously The Office is indisputably great. 30 Rock is, one of the funniest joke shows I've ever heard. But a lot of them get away with not being very funny because they can, because they don't have to appeal to an audience. That said, I've also been on shows where the show is so beloved by the audience that they will laugh at anything. And in some ways you're like, oh, come on, seriously, you're laughing at that? Because it allows certain writers to get lazy because they know that they can count on guaranteed laughter, whether a joke merits that response or not. And that's the flip side of it.
In your clubhouse room, this actually came up. because we discussed jumping the shark. We discussed Happy Days and what it became, and how people cheered anything on that show. So
That's
maybe we
true.
should just call it the
100%.
Happy Days syndrome.
Yes, that's exact. We definitely discussed that, and I've now lived long enough to be on shows that have experienced that. And I don't necessarily mean jumping the shark per se, but I do mean I've been on shows, and again, this is a classy problem to have, and it's a show that very few shows do have. But I have been on a show that is so loved by the people who love it that the audience response was not always indicative of the level of the jokes. But when I took over that show, again, not giving any names, but I haven't really disguised it too well because I've only taken over one show. I wanted the jokes to be things that I believed, earned the laughter, and that was a huge goal of mine upon taking the show over.
Are you a fan of Bob's Burgers?
I've never seen it.
I have to say, I marvel at that.
I know all the people who write it, and they're all lovely, hilarious people. So I would like it. I know that.
I don't know how through, I think it's 11 seasons, they are able to maintain this level of originality and freshness. And I have the same observation with Frasier. Maybe not the last year, but the fact that consistently good writing, season after season. How does that happen?
Well, here's the cavalier answer is it happens in the pilot. Basically, if you have created a show in which the characters have unique voices that we've never seen before, and dynamics in which they interact that are fresh, 11 years later, you're still writing that voice and those dynamics. And the flip side is, if it doesn't work in the pilot, it's never going to work. And I've been on many shows that you take because you need a job, and you're in the show's first season, and you can stay all night, and you can, load the room with high-paid, hack comedy writers throwing jokes at the wall all night, but it doesn't matter if the characters aren't inherently funny. You're kind of just sort of papering over your you're putting a Band-Aid on, on an axe wound. But so it does not surprise me that Bob's Burgers or Frasier are as funny from pillar to post because they're funny.
It would be absolutely great to have you on, like at least every quarter, where we take a show and or a couple shows and we do an anatomy of, because you look at a show like Mom, where it's consistently funny, but not only is it consistently funny, but the characters are consistently growing. They're on a journey of sobriety in this case.
Sure.
And even the loss of one of the main characters, my observation is the show has not suffered in the least bit for that. It's like they haven't missed a beat, and they still tip their hat to Anna Faris's character, and they continue on, and there's just this dynamic there. And those shows, they just become, even Big Bang Theory, I realize we're talking Chuck Lorre now, but the ability to sustain cast changes, the ability it's amazing to me.
Well,
because it could kill a show, but it doesn't in this case.
100%. So, but even beyond sustaining the loss of a cast member, Brian, I think you've hit on something that's even deeper, which is shows like that not only are able to maintain their level, like you said, they're not just maintaining the level of comedy, but they're finding greater depth in character as they go on, and that was not always the case in sitcoms. That is sort of a relatively new phenomenon. And whether it's old or new is not even really the issue. There are certain shows which, by design, are meant not to have growth. You know, two of the greatest shows of all time, The Simpsons and Seinfeld, are in their DNA meant to be enjoyed on an episode-to-episode basis, and no one ever grows, no one ever learns, and the knowledge that they accrue in one episode is not carried over into another. But in shows that you mentioned, specifically Frasier, Mom, Big Bang, all of those are far more serialized in nature, in that, you know, what happens in one episode impacts people's attitudes in the next episode, and from season to season. So that is it's a stylistic choice, and B, it's also a sort of generational change. It's far more the case now than it used to be, as sitcoms have gotten more serialized. I know Friends is given a lot of credit for bringing in elements of soap operas and applying them to the sitcom genre. Obviously, sort of the will they or won't they of Sam and Diane in Cheers is another example of that. But sort of prior to that, sitcoms, by and large, were more standalone entities. They existed to be watched one episode at a time, and if you miss an episode, no big whoop, because you can catch another one, and there's no substantive thing that you're missing. So, good questions, guys. You're stumbling into things that I don't even know we knew we were going to stumble into, but it really speaks to the way that the changes in the way people consume media in general and sitcoms in particular.
But you know, the point too is, like, I always think it's almost like a cautionary tale. I think a lot of writers try to run too quickly, and the development process becomes to a point where they feel there's nothing more they can give. So you're exactly right. If you've got a character arc across a season where your character begins here and ends there, of course you need to know your character and you need to know their journey. If you have a serialized content where every episode is in the moment and there's never any growth, if those characters aren't really well developed at the beginning, you're going to get stuck pretty quickly in understanding how they react in that moment. Because what you'd said about being in the room and, you know, coming in as a writer and trying to pick up on building characters that haven't been developed properly, even before you get to pilot moment, you're going to get stuck. Exactly the same thing happened to me last year. I was brought into a series. There was some like secondary characters, and as they were looking kind of at the storyboards, they were realizing then that the characters weren't really like working to their potential. I put a little room together. We got some people working on it, and I don't even know how many times we turned these character scenarios around. It was never going to work. It always kind of fell on deaf ears. The producers, the directors didn't like what was going on, and then we were never going to win the day. As a writer, that's really frustrating, to feel like you keep giving it another stab and it's still not right. And then you have to realize that the characters were so poorly developed. There's nothing you can do with that because they never dovetail with the story. They always feel like they're added on after rather than integrated into the cast of characters. It's a tough call. And on that point, I was wondering, say, for example, if one of your kids or a young person came to you and said they wanted to get into comedy writing.
Yes.
Warning them off immediately, like genuinely. And I know you did the work, like you read the work of the best comedy writers. You got in there, you immersed yourself.
Absolutely.
Is that the best thing to do? What tips would you give?
Well, you sort of alluded to my overall answer, which is I would first ask them if there is anything else they can do. and I know you might think that's kind of a glib, capricious answer, but it really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Like, writing is something whether it's comedy writing or drama writing or novel writing or playwriting, like it has to truly be in you, because it's not a fun life. It's not a fun life, and it's not a fun lifestyle. Between the torture of writing and the insecurity that comes with the life of a writer, and you can go years between paychecks while trying to support a family. Like, these are all things that you have to factor in. So I would say, like, can you do something else? Because it's not the can you, it's could you be satisfied with another life and another life choice? And if the answer is yes, I would beg you to do that. If you're like, oh, I'm looking at, being a CPA, or I'm looking at, writing jokes for television, like, well, yeah, obviously one is going to be a lot more secure, but if deep down in your soul, like it was with me, I'm like, there's nothing else that's going to bring me joy unless I pursue this, unless I take on my demons, unless I process my pain, unless I, face my greatest fears. I mean, it took me 7 years to write a spec script that got me on a TV show. And this is like with thinking about it every day and having another career in advertising. But like throughout that time, I was constantly saying, like, yes, I'm winning awards in advertising, but I still haven't finished a script. And I went through like 4 or 5 different partners. And I went through iterations where I tried it on my own, tried it with people. I tried it with the man who became my partner and set that aside for 2 years and came back to it. So, like, you really have to want it, because it's not, we joked about my overnight success, but there was nothing painless about it. So, like, you really have to, it's hard to describe, but like, on Clubhouse, I've talked to a lot of actors, and they feel the same way. Like, it's either in you or it's not. It's not a choice.
Yeah.
I don't want to call it a calling, because I'm not going into the priesthood, but but there is something to be said.
Yeah.
My nephew, all he ever wanted to do was write.
Okay.
And both my parents were in show business. I was in show business, and my father kept saying to him, well, what's your plan B? And he kept saying, I don't have a plan B, because if I have a plan B, I won't be able to do plan A, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And and I can remember, I know we've talked about Mike Langworthy. Mike and I have been friends for a long time. When my nephew first decided he wanted to be a writer, he came out to visit. He was maybe 16. We went to lunch. And Mike said, I'm telling you, you have to be this dedicated. If the choice is going to work or pitching a show or going to your mother's funeral, you will have to choose pitching a show.
Well, Mike's a little dramatic and a little
Yes,
dark,
he is, but the point was well taken. And I think it really sunk in, actually, because it was this dedication. And my nephew decided that he was not going to get out of college what everybody else was going to get out of college, because he wasn't going to learn to write there the way he wanted to write. So he quit school. I didn't judge him at all. I was like, go for it. But coming in traditional, not so much today, but back then, which is maybe 20 years ago, it was like, no. You're not worth anything if you don't go to college. That was before Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, all of that stuff. So,
sure.
Well, this has been like 2 amazing discussions. I can't believe how fast a half hour has gone.
This was fast. I didn't know the second one went by too.
Yes, it was like, we didn't have commercial breaks. It was only we've been past our 22-minute mark.
We have? Oh, I was having too much fun being a long-winded blowhard.
Well, what we say to guests that say they're having too much fun is that they must return. And so I feel like
you have me whenever you need me.
I feel like that anatomy of a sitcom and taking specific shows and having your perspective on that would be really valuable. And also I'm thinking, even for the writer's room on Clubhouse, which we do every Thursday at noon, as you know, it might even be a good, like every once in a while, to do an anatomy of, because there's so much to be gained, not just by looking at the mechanism and beats and all that stuff of sitcoms, but by looking at the story worlds that are created. Because you and Allison both didn't say it, but what you were saying was, if there's not a great story world and if there's not great characters established from the get-go, you've got nothing.
Right. And you can't say that. You can't say that in a writer's room, because it's somebody else's creation and you're there to serve it. And you can't be negative and you can't be fatalistic, but you know it. You know it intuitively, and you know it the first day. And there have been days I've walked out of the first. Yeah. This is not going to work, but let's stick around. Let's stick around as long as the network will have us. And usually it's not very long in those cases.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bryan, for being our guest today. Allison, thank you as always for being the wonderful collaborator and partner in crime that you are. And we welcome everyone to watch the Story Hour. Please subscribe. Hit the bell if you want to be notified of the next episode. And Bryan, we'll hear you on Clubhouse. I hope you'll join us there as well.
Thank you so much, guys. This was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Bryan.
Ours as well. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.